Hello, my name is David Peterson, and this is the Art of Language Invention. Episode 11, The Function of Gender. All right, today we're going to be talking about grammatical gender. Before we start, what is grammatical gender? I actually really like the definition that's on Wikipedia, who knows who they got it from, because it illustrates what I think is the most important part of grammatical gender and understanding why it exists and how to create it. A simple definition is that grammatical genders are classes of nouns reflected in the behavior of associated words. That's the real important part. There is no such thing as grammatical gender in a language if there isn't some sort of agreement pattern that's illustrated either by the modifiers or the verb inflection. For example, you could say that English has grammatical gender right now. You could just take all of the nouns and divide them up into two arbitrary categories and say that all of these nouns belong to gender X and all of these nouns belong to gender Y. You can do that and it doesn't mean anything because the modifiers don't change. That is, we'll use the same, the, and whatever articles we have. The adjectives don't change. There is no different agreement pattern in the verbs for different genders. Maybe we'd use different pronouns, but it's only really in the third person singular, so it's not that big a deal. So it wouldn't mean anything to say that there is grammatical gender in English. In order for there to be grammatical gender, it has to be reified in some other system. You have to be able to see it. The way grammatical genders arise is pretty simple, basically. You just have two different words that need to be disambiguated in some way. Or, maybe just like, which type of an X do you mean? And so somebody says the Y type of X as opposed to the Z type of X. And if people do that enough, eventually these Y and Z words criticize, shorten up, become affixes of some kind, and there you have a gender system. Especially if it's helpful if you're referring to things just by adjective. And so you can say the good Y category versus the good Z category, and people have an idea what you're talking about, as opposed to just saying the good one in English, where it could refer to literally any type of noun. As for what types of genders exist, it's important to note that while we have, the either masculine, feminine, or neuter, or sometimes maybe common and neuter genders in Western languages, this is really just selection bias. That is, all of the Indo-European languages and also the Semitic languages have sex-based gender systems. And while those are common, that doesn't necessarily need to be the way that you have a grammatical gender system. That is, the grammatical gender doesn't need to be tied to sex at all. Here are some examples of gender classes that exist in various languages across the world. A given language will have one or more of these in different bunches. As a conlanger, you can decide what exactly you'd like for your gender system to be. It doesn't need to be sex-based at all. And it doesn't need to be even as it can be more inventive than this. But it should be useful. That is, it makes sense to divide up the world into, for example, edible and inedible plants. If you have a hunter-gatherer culture, and it's very important to be able to distinguish poisonous from non-poisonous plants, especially if they look very similar. So think about your culture and what makes sense at the time that the language is essentially coming into being and the grammatical gender system is born. A better question than how gender systems come to exist is why they don't disappear. They do disappear from time to time, like English's gender system is gone, but they do tend to hold on as long as they possibly can. Like, look at French. It's still kicking around over in French despite the fact that they've lost like half of the sounds at the end of their words. It's probably on its way out, but it's still there. The reason that these gender systems still exist is that they are useful for processing. That is, it gives you a little bit more information in a sentence if you're able to tag one or more words in the sentence with a particular gender. So let's say that you didn't quite catch whatever noun was said in a sentence. It was noisy or something. If you hear some characteristic markers from one gender versus another, that can help you to better narrow down what it was you heard. And so the signal is a little bit stronger. Basically, it's redundancy that's built into the system via gender and the various agreement that's spread out across the sentence. That's why gender systems are useful and why they stick around even in the modern day. Gender marking can show up in one of a couple of ways. One, it can be an independent affix, though I would note that you'll see conlangers do this sometimes where you'll say my conlang has a gender system, but you don't have to mark it. No, that's not a gender system then. That's some sort of a different type of marking system. That's kind of like how in English you can say it's a boy chicken or a girl chicken. That's not a gender system, that's just something you can do. Gender is absolutely mandatory and it's an inherent part of the noun, whether it is marked explicitly or not. So something to keep in mind if you're designing a gender system. Anyway, so gender can be marked independently. It can also be rolled into one of a number of other affixes. So for example, it can be tied to number, it can be tied to case, it can be tied to case and number, or it cannot be marked at all on the noun, the gender only showing up somewhere else. That is, with an adjective or with a determiner or with marking on the verb, so that all the nouns just have whatever form they do, and you only know the gender if there's a modifier. Chances are, though, if you have this type of a language, it'll probably be very rare that a noun will be able to occur without some sort of a modifier, whether it's an article, definite or indefinite, or some sort of a characteristic adjective, or marking on the verb, either for subject, object, or indirect object. Also, whatever your gender system is, the association between whatever the prototypical category for that gender is and its association with the noun, it can be arbitrary. If it's a very strong marker, often the things coincide quite a bit. So like if you're a language that has a masculine and a feminine, chances are that the basic word for man is going to be masculine and the basic word for woman is going to be feminine. It'd be very odd if you found something different. But since all nouns have to belong to a gender, as you get further and further away from whatever that prototypical category is, things get a little weirder. So for example, let's look at one of my favorite examples from Latin. Latin has this old word sal, which gives us salt. And this shows up in various Romance languages with different genders. So in Latin, the word for salt could be masculine or neuter. In the singular, it was always masculine in the plural. So we call it basically masculine. And look at how it shows up in all of these Romance languages. I mean, this isn't even branching out into the rest of Indo-European. These are all languages that are descended more or less from Latin. And as you can see, I mean, there it is. It's feminine in Spanish. It's masculine in French. It's masculine in Portuguese. Feminine in Spanish, masculine in Portuguese. How does that happen? It's just, it boggles the mind. And so, but, this is kind of an informative example for a couple of reasons. One, it's not the case that, one particular thing is going to show up as the same gender in every single language across the board. Also, gender can change, moving from one language to another. That is, the proto-language might have some noun as gender A, and it might show up in daughter 1 as gender B, daughter 2 is gender A, daughter 3 is gender C if there's some other gender. You never know. It's really, really weird that way. And so that's something to kind of remember and play around with. Often things like phonology can knock out gender association, or strong semantic content can knock out phonology. It depends whichever one is going to win in your language. So that is, let's say that you have a word that, let's say because it's easiest, let's say that you have masculine and feminine, and you have a word for some human being that is masculine, but for whatever reason it happens to end in an ending that is a very, very prototypical feminine ending. It's a toss-up which gender it's going to end up in. It may change, daughter language by daughter language. I have found, this is just my general observation, that phonology seems to win out more than semantics more often than not. Phonology tends to be a very strong predictor of what is going to end up in which gender, because it's what you hear immediately. It seems to be more on the surface than the meaning of things. So that's something to keep in mind. It's fun to play with these mismatches when you're coining words. And also fun to, because this happens in Spanish and plenty of other gender languages, I'll bet, of just switching the gender of a word from one to another to just distinguish its meaning for some important reason. That's a thing that can happen, and it's something that you can play around with. So this is really just a basic introduction to the concept of gender. You can get into much more detail if you're looking at a specific system and a specific set of words. You can have a kind of a better idea of what you're doing, what the variables are, and what the confounding factors are that are going to determine what noun ends up in what gender and how the whole system works together. That's it for this episode. If you have a question you'd like to be answered on the show, leave a note in the comments or send an email to me at djpquery@gmail.com. If you want to see more episodes like this one, feel free to subscribe. Thanks for watching.